She was pressed against the hood of her own car, in her own driveway, on her own property, with her hands wrenched behind her back and a pair of steel handcuffs grinding shut around her wrists. And the only sound she made was a single, sharp breath, more from shock than from pain. Because she had known this was coming, had been watching it build for the past 20 minutes, and had made a deliberate, calculated, professional decision to let it happen. The driveway was hers. She had signed the closing documents 4 days earlier in a conference room downtown, her hand steady as she worked through 43 pages of legal documents without asking a single question, because she had read every line the night before. The house behind her was hers. The lawn was hers. The oak tree casting its long October shadow across the front walk was hers. And the officer now pressing her forward against the hood of her silver SUV, his hand wrapped too tightly around her upper arm, was standing on her property without her permission, arresting her for the crime of standing on her own driveway and saying no. Across the street, a woman in a zip-up fleece had stepped out onto her front porch, arms folded, watching with an expression that sat somewhere between vindication and relief. The look of someone who had made a phone call and was now watching the results arrive. 3 doors down, an older man in a cardigan had come out to retrieve his newspaper, and frozen on his front step, the newspaper forgotten in his hand. The officer doing the arresting was smiling. Not broadly, not cruelly, but with the small, tight smile of a man who believes he has just demonstrated something important about the natural order of things. He had no idea. He thought he was arresting a trespasser. He thought he was teaching a lesson about what happens when someone argues with a badge. He thought this was going to be another Saturday entry in a long, unbroken record of encounters that went exactly his way, because they always went his way, because nothing had ever happened to suggest they would not always go his way. He was not teaching a lesson. He was building a case against himself, one body cam second at a time, and the woman he had just pressed against the hood of her own car was already drafting the federal complaint in her head, organizing the counts in the same clean, methodical order she always used, beginning with the Fourth Amendment violation and working outward from there. Her name was Diana Caldwell. She was 44 years old. She had spent 16 years inside the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, and she had personally overhauled 3 entire police departments, using documents not much more complicated than the ones she was already composing in her mind. Officer Ryan Cole had not looked her up before stepping out of his cruiser. He had not asked her name before reaching for her wrist. He had not paused, not once, to consider the possibility that the black woman in the faded Georgetown law hoodie standing in the driveway of a $1 million craftsman home in Claremont Hills, Virginia, with a yellow tape measure in her hand and a leather notebook in her pocket, might know something he did not. That was his first mistake. Everything after it was just the fall. Let us go back to where it started, 14 hours earlier. Diana woke at 5:47 that morning in a house that was almost entirely empty, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular quiet happiness of a woman who has finally done a hard thing she has been putting off for too long. The air mattress on the floor of the master bedroom was the only furniture she had brought over from her apartment. Everything else was still in boxes, 14 of them, stacked against the wall of what would eventually be the living room. A careful arrangement that told you immediately that the woman who packed them was used to organizing complexity. Each box had a label written in the same clean block letters: kitchen tools, law review, binders, Marcus, clothes, fall, kitchen, every day, and one in the center of the stack that simply read, home, which was the only one she had allowed herself to be imprecise about. On the folding table near the window which served as her desk until the real one arrived on Tuesday, she had placed 3 things with care the night before: her DOJ laptop, a cracked Georgetown law mug that she had owned since her first year of law school and refused to replace because she had been drinking from it when she found out she passed the bar exam, and a framed photograph of Marcus. Her husband, Marcus, had been dead for 14 months. He had died on a Wednesday in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, holding her left hand in both of his and telling her that the most useful thing she could do after he was gone was to stop working through lunch every single day, which they both knew was not going to happen, and which both of them chose not to mention. He had been 39 years old. He had been a high school history teacher. He had believed genuinely and without irony that the American legal system was redeemable, and he had been married for 9 years to a woman whose job was to spend every working day trying to prove him right. Diana had found this neighborhood 3 years earlier when they were looking together before the diagnosis. Marcus had stood on the sidewalk outside this house on a quiet October afternoon and said, "This is the kind of street where a kid could ride a bike to the end and back." And the sentence had stayed with her long after the house went off the market, and long after there was no longer a kid to imagine, and long after October became the month that meant something different to her. She had bought this house for him, and for herself, and for the version of the future that she was not finished building. She made coffee in a French press she had unpacked from the kitchen everyday box, because some things are not negotiable. Poured it into the cracked Georgetown mug, and stood on the back porch in bare feet and let the October morning settle into her lungs. The yard needed work. There was a section of fence that listed to the right, and the garden beds along the south wall had been neglected for at least 2 seasons, and were full of something that had once been decorative grass and was now simply aggressive. She looked at all of it without feeling overwhelmed, the way you can look at a complicated case when you have been doing this long enough to know that every problem has a sequence, and every sequence has an entry point. Diana Caldwell had been inside the Civil Rights Division for 16 years. In that time, she had personally written consent decrees that dismantled the daily operational culture of 3 separate police departments in 2 different states. She had deposed officers, precinct captains, police union representatives, mayors, and in one memorable case, a state attorney general who had made the mistake of treating her like she might be intimidated by his title. She had argued before federal appellate panels with the same even, measured cadence she used when ordering coffee, because she had learned early in her career that calm was the most authoritative register available to her in any room, and she had never stopped using it. She had a habit that she had carried since her first year of law school, which was pressing her right thumb firmly against the inside of her left wrist when she was thinking through a problem. A grounding gesture she had developed during exams and kept because it worked. The light pressure of her own thumb against the pulse point there, doing something that helped her brain arrange the pieces in the right order. This morning, the problem she was thinking through was the wraparound porch. Marcus Webb, her contractor, was due at 10. She had found him through a referral from the previous homeowners, who had said he was the best craftsman in the county, and that he would tell her what the porch actually needed rather than what he could charge her the most to do, which in Diana's experience was a genuinely rare quality. She had a notebook, a small leather one with measurements she had already taken from photographs, and a list of questions she intended to walk through with him. She went back inside, refilled her mug, put on the faded Georgetown law hoodie she had owned for 11 years, and went out the front door with her yellow tape measure, her leather notebook, and the uncomplicated contentment of a woman on a Sunday morning with a plan and a house and a porch that needed measuring. Claremont Hills was the kind of neighborhood that took its own maintenance seriously, and you could see it in the way every driveway was edged, every hedge was shaped, every seasonal flower bed was updated with what felt like military precision. The chrysanthemums and ornamental kale appearing overnight in early October as if by committee decision, which, in this case, they more or less were, because the HOA newsletter had run a reminder about fall planting in the September issue, alongside updates about the new speed bump proposal, and a notice about a lost tabby named Creamsicle, who had apparently been missing for 3 weeks. The oaks were extraordinary. They lined both sides of Greenwood Lane in a cathedral arch that had been growing for 40 years, and in October they turned a deep, saturated gold that made the whole street look lit from inside. And the leaves came down slowly, 1 or 2 at a time in the morning stillness, spinning in the pale light, before settling on the perfectly edged lawns below. Diana measured the front railing first, working left to right, crouching occasionally to check the condition of the anchor points where the railing met the porch floor. Standing again to extend the tape measure along the full span, calling the number out to herself and writing it in her notebook. She moved methodically, unhurried, occasionally peering at a joint from close range, the way you lean in to read small print. Across the street at number 22, the bay window curtain moved. Gloria Stanton was 67 years old, retired from 30 years as a school district administrator, widowed 4 years ago, and occupying her considerable organizational intelligence with the management of the Claremont Hills Neighborhood Watch, which she had founded herself, and of which she was the sole officer, because none of her neighbors had been willing to be as committed as the role required, which Gloria understood to mean that none of them took community safety as seriously as she did. She wore a zip-up fleece every morning that had the Neighborhood Watch logo embroidered on the left breast pocket, a small design featuring a stylized eye and the word Vigilance in block letters below it. And she adjusted this logo when she was about to do something she was not entirely at peace with, a habit she did not know she had. Gloria had known the Whitfield family, who had lived in Diana's house for 9 years before moving to be closer to their daughter in Charlotte. She had not known because she had not been told, and had not thought to ask, that the Whitfields had sold the house. She knew the house was vacant, or had believed it to be vacant, and what she was looking at through her bay window was a black woman she did not recognize in sweatpants and a hoodie, walking deliberately around the perimeter of a vacant property, crouching near the base of the porch, peering at the windows from close range, holding what appeared to be measuring equipment. Gloria watched for 90 seconds. She did not walk across the street. She did not open her front door and call out a greeting. She did not consider that there might be a reasonable explanation for what she was seeing, because the picture in her mind had already formed, and the explanation was already written inside it. She adjusted the Neighborhood Watch logo on her fleece. She picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency line. She described to the dispatcher a suspicious individual casing a vacant property. She used the word prowling. She described the clothing. She gave the address. She described the skin color with the particular careful specificity of someone who knows the description would not be the same if the person across the street were white, and who has not examined what that tells her about herself, and who at this moment has no intention of doing so. She hung up. She went back to the window. She kept watching. The morning was still golden, still quiet, the leaves still coming down one at a time in the October light. Diana kept measuring her porch. Officer Ryan Cole had been on the force for 7 years, and had spent most of those 7 years in this part of the county, which he thought of as his territory, in the way that some men think of certain bars as their bar, or certain parking spots as their spot, with a proprietary certainty that has no legal basis and does not require one, because it has never been challenged in any way that mattered. He was 31, lean in the way of someone who worked out with the same competitive intensity he brought to everything else, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of jaw that looked permanently clenched even when he was relaxed, which he rarely was. His uniform was always pressed, and his boots were always polished, and he wore the badge with the attention other men gave to expensive watches, aware of it at all times, aware of what it communicated. He had a habit, and it was not a conscious one, of sliding the pad of his right thumb along the bottom edge of his badge whenever he was about to assert authority. A small repetitive motion that he performed the way another person might clear their throat before speaking. A kind of physical preparation, a way of confirming that the thing was there, and the thing was real, and the thing gave him what he needed for whatever came next. His understanding of his job, stated in his own internal language, was this: the people who lived in neighborhoods like Claremont Hills had worked to earn what they had there, or their families had, and they paid their taxes because they expected those taxes to maintain a certain standard of order. And maintaining that order meant keeping out the people who did not belong there. And identifying who did not belong was something that 7 years of patrol experience had given him the instinct to do reliably and without hesitation. He thought of this instinct as professionalism. He had 6 prior complaints in his personnel file. Not 6 complaints that had been investigated and resolved. 6 complaints that had been received by Captain Howell's desk, logged by an administrative assistant, reviewed internally by the department itself, and marked as unsubstantiated, which in this department meant that someone had decided not to look too carefully and had signed a form saying so. Cole knew the complaints existed. He also knew that knowing about them had never cost him anything, which had taught him, with the slow, reliable logic of repeated experience, that they never would. Pete Dawson was driving, as Dawson usually did, because driving gave him something to do that was not thinking too hard about the places Cole wanted to take them. Dawson was 48, 23 years on the force, 9 months from the retirement date he had circled on the kitchen calendar in red marker, a countdown that had become the primary organizing principle of his professional life. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired one, which in certain situations produced outcomes that looked similar from the outside. Dawson had a habit of adjusting the rearview mirror very slightly when he was uncomfortable. Not because the angle needed changing, but because having something to do with his hands made it easier to do nothing else. The dispatch came in at 9:43. Suspicious person, Claremont Hills, Greenwood Lane, the old Whitfield property. Caller reporting a black female in dark clothing walking the perimeter of a vacant home. Cole heard this and felt a particular alerting sensation he always felt when a dispatch confirmed something he already knew, which was that his instincts were right, and that this was why the county needed someone like him in neighborhoods like this. He slid his thumb along the bottom of his badge. "Let us go check it out," he said. Dawson put the car in drive. He adjusted the mirror. The cruiser turned onto Greenwood Lane at a pace that was not exactly slow, but was not the pace of a vehicle responding to anything urgent either. And Cole had it positioned and parked before Diana fully registered what was happening. The front bumper of the black and white, cutting diagonally across the rear quarter of her silver SUV, so that her car was blocked on the street side without her having been given any reason to leave. The sound of it was the first thing she noticed, which was the particular crunch of tires on fallen oak leaves compressed against the asphalt. The sound both ordinary and, in this context, immediately wrong. And then the sound of 2 car doors opening in sequence, and then footsteps, one set moving toward her across the lawn with the deliberate, unhurried weight of a man who does not believe he will be asked to justify his approach, and one set stopping near the cruiser and remaining there. October had put a bite in the air that morning, the good, clean kind of cold that made the sky look more saturated than it actually was, and the wood smoke from the chimney of the Calloway house at the far end of the block drifted across in a thin, sweet thread, and the light came through the oaks at an angle that turned everything it touched the color of old gold. Diana registered all of it with the peripheral awareness she had trained herself to maintain in difficult situations, because noticing your environment keeps you present, and being present keeps you effective. And she was already calculating what this situation might require of her. She set the tape measure down on the porch railing, visible and non-threatening action, completed slowly and deliberately, and she let her hands hang at her sides, with the fingers slightly spread, and she turned to face the approaching officer with the expression she used in federal court when opposing counsel said something she found professionally unimpressive but was not yet ready to address. Cole stepped across her property line without pausing, without announcing himself, without any of the small courtesies that distinguish an officer making a welfare check from an officer establishing dominance. And he stopped about 4 feet from her, with his right hand resting near his belt in a posture that was not quite threatening, but was designed to remind her that the option was available. "Good morning," he said without making it sound like one. "Good morning," Officer Diana said, and she kept her voice even and her hands where they were. Her contractor was due in 20 minutes. She had 4 more measurements to take. She wanted to be done before he arrived. She was aware of all of this, and she filed it away, because it was not relevant to the next few minutes. Cole told her there had been a call about a suspicious person at this address. He looked her up and down in the slow, deliberate way that was meant to communicate assessment, but actually communicated something else, his eyes moving from the hoodie to the yoga pants to the yellow tape measure on the railing, and his expression registered none of what he saw as information that contradicted anything he already believed. Diana told him she was the homeowner. She had closed on Thursday. She was waiting for her contractor. Cole's jaw shifted slightly. Not a flinch, not surprise, but the specific micro-adjustment of a person who has heard something that does not fit the picture they came in with, and has decided the picture is correct and the information is wrong. He exchanged a glance over his shoulder with Dawson, a fast sideways look. And Dawson, who was standing near the passenger door of the cruiser with one hand resting on the roof, adjusted the rearview mirror through the open window, even though he was not sitting in the car. Cole said he would need to see some identification. Diana explained calmly and without elevation in her voice that her identification was inside her purse, which was inside her locked vehicle on the street, and that she was currently standing on her own private property with no articulable criminal activity taking place, and that under the law, she was not required to produce identification in that situation, and that she was happy to talk with him, but she wanted to be clear about what her legal obligations were and were not. Cole reached for burglary in progress as his stated basis for demanding identification, and Diana let him finish the sentence before she responded, which was a technique she had learned from a federal appellate judge she had clerked for at 26. The idea being that the most devastating way to address an argument is to let it complete itself before you begin, because partial arguments have a way of looking more reasonable than they deserve. She explained, standing on her own porch in her Georgetown law hoodie in the October morning, with her tape measure on the railing behind her, that a burglary in progress required an actual crime to be occurring, and that she was standing in the open, in daylight, holding measuring equipment, and that the legal standard established by Terry v. Ohio required reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity, and that an anonymous call from a neighbor who had seen a black woman she did not recognize walking around a property did not meet that standard. She did not say this quickly. She did not say it with heat. She said it the way she said things in federal court, with the clean, deliberate pacing of someone who knows that the record is what matters, and the record requires clarity. Cole's thumb went to the badge again, twice in quick succession, and he stepped forward, closing the distance between them by about 18 inches, in a move that was entirely about physical space and the authority it implies. And from somewhere behind him, Dawson took a half step forward and then stopped himself. Cole began to speak and then seemed to decide something mid-sentence, and what came out was the line he landed on, the one that would live in the record for the next 8 months. The one that would be displayed on a flat-screen monitor in a conference room in downtown Washington, while a room full of attorneys sat in complete silence. Lady Cole said, "I do not know where you got your legal education, but in this neighborhood, when a badge asks you a question, you answer it. People who look like they belong here do not need to argue about it." The phrase hung in the October air above her porch, like wood smoke, visible and unmistakable. Diana heard it. She processed it the way she processed things in depositions, which was with the outward stillness of someone who has just received exactly the piece of information they were waiting for, and has chosen not to react in the moment because the moment is not the optimal place for the reaction. She pressed her right thumb against the inside of her left wrist, her thinking habit, her grounding ritual, and she felt her own pulse under the pressure, steady and regular. And she organized what she had just heard into its proper category, and moved on to the next few seconds. Cole escalated his demands, telling her she was being uncooperative, that her refusal to produce identification constituted obstruction, that continuing to argue with him in this manner was going to result in a disorderly conduct charge, and that if she wanted to avoid that outcome, she should walk to her car right now and get her ID. Diana looked at him for a moment before responding. Not a long moment, just long enough for the silence to establish itself. And then she said, speaking clearly and at a volume she had calibrated for outdoor recording, that she was not obstructing. She was standing on her property and declining to produce identification, which the law permitted her to do, and that she wanted to make clear for the record that she had cited the relevant legal standard, had identified herself as the homeowner, and was at all times cooperating with the conversation, while declining only the specific request she had the right to decline. There was a client Diana had represented 4 years earlier, a 19-year-old named Curtis, who had been stopped 6 times in 8 months while walking to a community college in Baltimore. 6 times, on 6 different mornings, on 6 different blocks, always in some variation of the same exchange. A demand for identification, a question about where he was going and why, a search of his backpack that found nothing because there was nothing to find, and then a release without apology or explanation, and never once a report filed, with the language that would connect these 6 incidents in any official record. Because the way these things stayed invisible was by treating each one as its own isolated event, with no author and no pattern. Curtis had come to her office with a shoebox of handwritten notes. He had kept a date and a location and an officer's name every single time, because his grandmother had told him when he was 12 years old to always write down the name. And she had built a case from that shoebox that resulted in a consent decree and mandatory retraining for an entire precinct, and a formal apology from a police chief who had not believed an apology was necessary until a federal judge told him otherwise. Curtis had not had a DOJ badge. Curtis had had a shoebox and a grandmother with good advice. Diana thought about Curtis, and she thought about a woman named Hattie Bowman, 71, a retired school teacher who had filed a complaint with this very department 18 months ago after being detained for 40 minutes while walking her dog near this exact neighborhood. A complaint that had been marked unsubstantiated within a week and filed in a drawer where it had been quietly kept ever since. Diana knew about Hattie Bowman because she had read the precinct's complaint resolution record 3 weeks before she closed on this house, which was the kind of thing Diana Caldwell did before moving into a neighborhood. She thought about Marcus, her husband, who had believed in the redeemability of the system with a patience she had found both moving and occasionally maddening, and who had once said to her during a late dinner when she was exhausted and furious after a particularly brutal court day, "The arguments you win in court are important, but the arguments you live are the ones that last." She pressed her thumb against her wrist. Cole was standing in front of her, his hand near his belt, his jaw set, his badge catching the October light, waiting for her to back down. She was not going to back down. She was going to stand here on her own porch and let Officer Ryan Cole show everybody exactly who he was when he did not know anyone was watching, except that somebody was always watching. And this morning that somebody happened to be a senior litigator with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, who had been building cases like this one for 16 years. Diana said to him plainly, and at recording volume, that she was not obstructing. She was not being disorderly. She was standing on her own private property, exercising her legal rights, and that if he believed he had probable cause to arrest her, he was welcome to proceed, and that if he did not have probable cause, she would like him to step off her property. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. A leaf separated from the oak overhead and spun down slowly in the still air between them, and landed on the porch step without a sound. 2 houses down, Gloria Stanton had come off her porch and was standing at the edge of her property on the sidewalk, arms still folded, watching with the expression of someone who has called for something and is now witnessing its delivery. The retired man in the cardigan at the end of the block had not moved. His newspaper was still in his hand. Cole stepped forward and took Diana's left wrist. He did not grab it with the violence of someone who has lost control. He took it with the deliberate decisiveness of someone who believes they are in complete control. And he twisted it behind her back, in the smooth, practiced motion of a person who has done this many times. And Diana made a single, sharp sound, not a cry, not a protest, a breath that escaped before she could moderate it. Because the shock of another person's hands on her body in that context is a thing the mind can prepare for, and the body cannot. She began speaking immediately, out loud, her voice clear and steady, and aimed at the body cam light she had confirmed was illuminated on Dawson's chest from the moment he stepped out of the cruiser. She said her name. She said she was compliant. She said she was not resisting. She said she was on her private property. She said she was not pulling away from the officer. She said she wanted the record to show that she was completely still. Cole told her to stop resisting. She was not resisting. She was standing still with her arm behind her back, saying that she was standing still with her arm behind her back. And the distinction between those two things was the entire case. The cuffs came from Cole's belt in one motion, and they went on badly, not with the clean double click of a properly applied restraint, but with a grinding, ratcheting sound, metal teeth engaging under pressure that was harder than necessary. And the sensation was cold first, and then biting. A specific thin pain at the wrist bones where the steel pressed into the soft tissue above her pulse, and then a spreading numbness that moved through her fingers as the circulation was reduced, and then the beginning of the burn that meant the fit was too tight. And the fit was too tight on purpose. She registered all of it. She kept talking, steady calm. The air held the smell of wood smoke from down the block, and beneath it, closer, Cole's deodorant, and something else underneath that. Something bitter and chemical that she associated with the particular kind of stress a person produces when they are doing something they know is going to be difficult to defend. The texture of her hoodie was rough against her cheek as he moved her forward toward the cruiser hood. Behind her, she could hear Dawson's boots on the gravel of the driveway, slower than Cole's, a reluctant rhythm. Cole said something as he walked her to the car, low, but not low enough. Another gift for the body cam, people like you. Make everything harder than it needs to be, people like you. The second instance. Dawson's camera was still running. Dawson, out of habit or discomfort or both, lifted his hand toward the rearview mirror of the cruiser, even though he was not inside it, and then seemed to realize what he was doing and let the hand drop to his side. Diana was placed in the back of the cruiser, and the door slammed shut with the heavy finality of something sealed, and through the scratched plexiglass divider she could see her house, her porch, her new railings with their gentle sag in the middle of the left side, and her yellow tape measure, still lying exactly where she had set it on the railing. Exactly the way she had left it. She sat with her back straight and her hands behind her, and she breathed steadily, and she organized the morning into its proper sections, the way she always organized things, beginning at the beginning and moving forward with the clean precision of someone who knows exactly what she is going to do next. The inside of the cruiser smelled of industrial disinfectant and old sweat, and beneath those two things, faintly, the specific synthetic smell of the flame-resistant material they used in police car upholstery. The heater was running at a setting appropriate for mid-January, despite the October morning being perfectly temperate outside. And the plastic seat had the slick, cold quality of something that was not designed for the comfort of the people who sat in it. And the grid of the plexiglass divider cast a shadow across her knees that divided the light in the back seat into small, even rectangles. Through the divider she could hear Cole and Dawson in the front seat, their voices partially obscured by the radio, and Cole was using the word combative about her, in the specific way that word gets used in incident reports when officers need a shorthand for, "I encountered someone who knew their rights," and Dawson was not echoing it, which Diana noted. Cole said that he had been through this before, these neighborhood watch calls, these situations where someone thinks they own the street, and that the thing to do was to be clear about who was in charge and what happened when you were not. Dawson said nothing. He adjusted the mirror. Diana thought about the tape measure on the porch railing. She thought about Marcus Webb arriving at 10 o'clock to find an empty driveway and no one answering the door. She thought, let them book me. Every step they take from here is evidence. That Sunday evening, after everything that was going to happen had happened, Ryan Cole sat at his kitchen table with a beer he had opened and not drunk, and his badge on the table in front of him face up. And he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has had a difficult day and handled it correctly. He had processed a resistant subject. He had maintained authority in a situation where a citizen had tried to use legal language to undermine the stop. He had done his job. He picked up his badge and held it in his palm, turning it slightly, so the overhead light caught the shield. And then he set it back down on the table with the small, deliberate sound of a man placing something he is proud of somewhere safe. He was not worried about the woman. Entitled people always threaten to sue. They never did, or when they did, nothing came of it, because the law understood that officers had to be able to do their jobs without being second-guessed by every citizen who had watched a documentary. Captain Howell would handle it. Captain Howell always handled it. He finished the beer and went to bed. He slept well. He was still sleeping well on Monday morning when at 9:12, the Alexandria Police Department received a preservation order from the United States Department of Justice. The booking room of the Alexandria precinct was the kind of room that had absorbed so much of the same kind of event decade after decade that the room itself seemed to have developed an opinion about what it was witnessing. The fluorescent lights ran the full length of the ceiling in parallel strips and gave everything beneath them the slightly washed-out quality of a place where the sun has never had direct access, and the smell was disinfectant and old coffee, and something underneath those two things that she associated with the collective ambient stress of people who spent their working lives inside this room, and people who arrived here against their will. The keyboards in the room were of the heavy institutional kind, and they produced a sound that was somewhere between typing and percussion. A constant rhythmic clatter that was the background noise of everything that happened here. And the phone on the desk to the left of the front counter had been ringing at irregular intervals since they came in, and nobody had answered it. Sergeant Carol Marsh was behind the elevated front desk, and she looked up from her computer monitor with the expression of someone managing the 12th interruption of the morning, and prepared to manage it the same way she had managed the previous 11. She saw Cole first, which was routine, and then she saw the woman Cole was marching to the counter, and she spent approximately 2 seconds looking at Diana Caldwell before she had registered something that made the assessment in her eyes shift from processing to attention. Diana's posture was entirely correct. Her expression was entirely controlled. She was not crying. She was not begging. She was not performing outrage. She was simply standing there with her hands behind her and her back straight and her eyes on Marsh's face, with the focused, neutral expression of someone who is making a very thorough mental record of this interaction, and has been doing so since before they walked in. This is not a burglar, Sergeant Marsh thought. And the thought was not sympathetic exactly, it was professional. The assessment of someone who has processed a great many bookings and has learned to read the tells. Cole delivered his version of the morning's suspicious person, Claremont Hill's vacant property, refused to produce identification, obstructed the investigation, disorderly conduct, combative, resistant. He used the word combative twice. Marsh looked at Diana. Her hands were behind her back in the cuffs, and her chin was level, and she was looking at Marsh the way a person looks at someone they believe is going to do the right thing, and are waiting patiently for that moment to arrive. Marsh asked her for her name, neutral, procedural. Diana gave it clearly, in a voice calibrated for the room, for the ceiling-mounted camera in the corner, behind Marsh's desk, for the audio on the body cams, for whatever recording this moment would eventually be reviewed on. Then she said, "I'm a Senior Civil Rights Litigator with the United States Department of Justice. Civil Rights Division." The keyboard clatter stopped, not all at once, not with any coordination, but one by one. The way things go quiet in a room when the thing that has just been said requires everyone present to stop what they were doing and process it. And the phone rang once more in the silence, and no one moved toward it. The first thing that happened was physical, and it moved through the booking room the way cold moves through a room when a window opens, which is not all at once, but in a spreading wave that you feel before you identify it. Sergeant Marsh's pen stopped moving against the booking form at exactly the moment the words Civil Rights Division registered in the part of her brain responsible for professional risk assessment, and the pen simply remained where it was pressed against the paper, but not writing. To Marsh's right, a junior officer who had been walking from one desk to another with a manila folder tucked under his arm stopped walking and stood in the middle of the room with the particular suspended quality of a person who is recalibrating whether they want to be in motion right now. At the far end of the counter, a dispatcher who had been typing with both hands lifted them slightly off the keyboard and placed them in her lap. The phone rang once more into the silence. Cole was standing to Diana's left, and the transformation in his posture was the most interesting thing in the room to watch, because it happened in stages. The triumphant quality that had organized his body since the moment he snapped the cuffs on began to decompress with the slow and somewhat graceless movement of something being deflated from an unexpected puncture. His thumb moved toward his badge and then stopped hovering in the air near his chest, and the gesture remained incomplete floating there uselessly, like something that had lost its purpose mid-motion. And then the second thing arrived, which was internal, and it was Cole's. And it moved through him like the memory of something he had not wanted to remember. He heard himself on the porch 22 minutes earlier, in the arc of this morning, saying, "People who look like they belong here do not need to argue about it." And he heard it the way you hear your own voice played back on a recording, which is wrong in a way you cannot immediately explain. Too high, too certain, too exposed. And he understood, as the phrase moved through his memory, that it had not been said in a private room, but had been said outdoors, on a residential street, with Dawson's body cam running and the indicator light confirmed, and every syllable captured on audio that would now be subject to a federal preservation order, before he finished filling out the arrest report. He also heard himself 4 minutes after that saying, "People like you make everything harder than it needs to be." His thumb completed its movement toward the badge, then stopped, then dropped. He could not make himself touch it. And then the third thing happened, which was the eye contact. And it was brief and complete, and communicated more than the rest of the scene combined. Sergeant Marsh looked at Diana Caldwell across the booking counter, and Diana met her gaze and held it for 3 full seconds. And what passed between those two women in that exchange was the specific knowledge that they were both absolutely clear on what had happened and what was going to happen next, and that the time for ambiguity about either of those things had passed. Marsh stood up from behind her desk. "Take the cuffs off her," Cole Marsh said. Cole said she had been obstructing, said she had refused a lawful order, said the arrest was justified. His voice carrying the particular strained quality of a person arguing for a position they know has already been decided against. "I said, take them off," Marsh said, and her voice had dropped to the register that people in authority use when they are not going to say the thing a third time. Dawson moved before Cole did. He had been standing near the door since they came in the position of a person who is technically present in a room, but is trying to occupy as little of it as possible. And when Marsh said, "Take them off," the second time, Dawson was already crossing the room with the speed of a man who sees an opportunity to do the right thing and intends to take it before it closes. The cuffs came off with the soft clatter of metal dropped from the correct height to avoid making more noise than necessary. Diana brought her arms forward, slowly rotating her wrists in the deliberate, unhurried motion of someone taking inventory of their own body. And she looked at her wrists, and what she saw there were 2 rings of compressed skin, vivid and precise, the specific red-purple of tissue that has been pressed past comfort and beneath the surface of the skin. The beginning of the bruising that would take 10 days to fully appear, and another 2 weeks after that to fully fade. She looked at them for 3 seconds, not with performance, not with drama, with the focused attention of someone making an accurate record of evidence. Then she looked at Cole. Cole, stripped of the cuffs as a visual prop, looked the same size he had always been, and simultaneously somehow less. His badge was still on his chest, still gleaming under the fluorescent strips, but the authority it was meant to generate was not moving outward from it, the way it usually did. Diana issued her instructions to the room in the ordered way she had been constructing since the cruiser ride. She wanted her car keys. She wanted Officer Dawson sent back to her property to retrieve her tote bag from her locked vehicle. She wanted to remain here in the booking room in full view of the ceiling cameras and the ambient audio of the room, and not be taken to any private office or back hallway. She said this last point directly and without softening it, because the reason for it was obvious, and she wanted it in the record that she understood what private rooms in precincts were sometimes used for, and she was declining to enter one. Cole attempted one more effort, telling Marsh that Diana had been obstructing a lawful investigation, that she had cited case law to avoid a lawful identification request, that the arrest had been procedurally sound and the charges were legitimate, and that releasing her without processing would set a precedent in this district. Marsh looked at him with the expression of a person who has been a sergeant for 11 years and has heard every version of this argument and has opinions about all of them. She said Cole. She cited Terry versus Ohio on her own porch while holding a tape measure. Captain Dennis Howell arrived through the doors at a pace that told everyone in the room that Marsh's text had found him in a meeting, and that he had understood immediately which meeting was no longer the most important thing happening in his building. He was straightening his tie as he came through the door, and there was already a thin film of perspiration on his forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Dawson came back through the sally port doors 11 minutes later, carrying Diana's black leather tote bag, with the careful deliberateness of a man returning something that should not have left its owner's possession. Diana unzipped the bag. She moved through the contents with the same methodical attention she had given to the porch measurements that morning, and she found the slim leather bifold near the top, and she removed it and opened it. The badge caught the light from the fluorescent strips above, which was not the most flattering light in existence, but which was clear and direct and left nothing ambiguous. And it read exactly what it said it read. Diana Caldwell, Senior Litigator, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. Sergeant Marsh looked at it and then closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Captain Howell opened his mouth. Diana spoke first. She said, "Captain, I need you to understand something clearly before we go any further, which is that I am not here for an apology, and I am not interested in having this morning disappear into an internal review process. And the first thing I need from you right now is to confirm that every camera in this room has been recording since Officer Cole and I walked through that door, because everything from here forward is also evidence." Howell said, "Of course." Diana did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had been in enough federal courtrooms over enough years to understand that volume is what people use when they are not certain their words alone will carry the weight. She addressed Sergeant Marsh first, and she thanked her for the prompt removal of the restraints, and she said she would be noting in her documentation that Marsh had acted appropriately once the situation was clarified. She addressed Dawson next, and she told him she had observed from the moment of his arrival at the property that he had not verbally agreed with Cole's characterizations of her behavior, and that his prompt return of her property had also been noted, and that if he was a person who wanted to continue working in law enforcement in this region, now would be the appropriate time to make choices consistent with that goal. She addressed Howell next, and she removed every comfortable interpretation from the room before he had a chance to settle into one. She told him that no apology, however sincerely delivered, would alter the fact that the arrest had happened, that the charges had been filed, that the cuffs had been applied with excessive force, that had produced visible injury to her wrists, and that an expungement of the arrest record was not an erasure of the event, but an attempt to conceal it from future review, and that she was not interested in concealment. She was interested in documentation. She said the record of this morning is not an embarrassment I'm asking you to make disappear. It is evidence I'm asking you to preserve. She turned to Cole last. She named the constitutional violations in sequence: unlawful detention without reasonable articulable suspicion, false arrest without probable cause, excessive force in the application of restraints evidenced by injury. And then she named what she had observed beneath those legal categories: an officer who had stopped a black woman on her own property, been given a clear and legally accurate explanation of why his demand was not legally required, and had escalated to arrest not because any crime had occurred, but because she had said no to him, and he had found that intolerable. Cole began to say something, and Howell stepped forward and said his name. Just his last name. With the quiet, decisive weight of a man who understands that anything Cole says in this room right now will be recorded and will make things worse. Cole stopped. Diana said, "I have reviewed your precinct's complaint resolution record, Captain. There are 6 prior complaints against Officer Cole, all reviewed internally, no findings. I am now the 7th. She paused. "You have 30 minutes before I call my office." Howell went to Diana with an offer: full expungement of the arrest record, formal apology in writing, Cole placed on administrative review. Diana looked at him with the expression she used in depositions when an opposing attorney said something that revealed how little they understood about the case. She said an expungement means the record disappears. I do not want the record to disappear. I want it preserved, intact, because it is evidence, and evidence does not stop being evidence because it embarrasses someone. She picked up her tote bag. She thanked Sergeant Marsh by name. She walked to the door. Howell said, and she could hear in his voice the specific desperation of a man watching the last option close. "Miss Caldwell, please let us at least drive you home." Diana said, "I will call a car. I need the time." The heavy glass doors swung open, and she walked through them, and they closed behind her. And the booking room was silent for the length of time it takes a person to understand that something permanent just happened. And then Howell turns to look at Cole. And Cole, for the first time in 7 years, looked genuinely, thoroughly afraid. The October morning was still there when she came out, which surprised her somehow. Not because she had expected it to change, but because the inside of that building had been so thoroughly its own sealed world that the continuation of the street and the light and the smell of the air required a small adjustment. She stood on the precinct steps and took one full breath in and let it out slowly. And then she pressed her right thumb against the inside of her left wrist, her thinking habit, her grounding ritual. And she felt the tender ridge where the handcuff had pressed, warm and slightly swollen under her thumb. And she held that sensation without pulling away from it, because the point of grounding yourself is to be where you are. She called Priya Okafor. Priya picked up on the second ring and moved through the stages of the next 30 seconds with the speed that characterized her professionally, from cheerful to horrified to furious to sharply coldly focused, in approximately the same time it took other people to understand the first sentence of what they were hearing. She asked the questions in the right order. Body cam footage, both officers' booking records, the specific language used, the name of the neighbor who called, the condition of Diana's wrists, the timestamp on the arrest. Diana answered each one in sequence. Then she told Priya about the two specific phrases. "People who look like they belong here do not need to argue about it." And the second one, 4 minutes later, walking to the cruiser. "People like you make everything harder than it needs to be." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Was Dawson's camera on the whole time?" Priya asked. Diana said, "I confirmed the indicator light when he stepped out of the vehicle. And he never turned it off." Another pause, shorter this time. Priya said, "This is going to be large." Diana looked at the flag above the precinct entrance, which was moving slightly now, in a breeze that had come up from somewhere in the last hour, and a leaf from one of the oaks on the far sidewalk detached and came down in a slow spinning arc and landed on the top step near her foot. She said, "I know. That is why I let him do it." Marcus Webb's truck was still parked in front of the house when the car dropped her off, which meant he had waited. And she was grateful for this, in the specific way you are grateful for people who do the uncomplicated, decent thing without being asked. He was sitting on the porch steps with his phone in his hand and a paper coffee cup from the gas station 2 blocks away. And he stood up when the car pulled up, and he watched her walk up the driveway with the careful attention of a man who notices things and does not always comment on them. And when she got close enough that he could see her wrists, he looked at them for 1 second, and then looked at her face. He said, "Miss Caldwell, I'm sorry I was not here earlier." She said it would not have changed anything if you had been. He nodded. He understood what this meant and what it did not mean, and he did not ask her to explain further. They walked the porch together. Diana still had her leather notebook from her hoodie pocket, and she read him the measurements she had taken that morning, the numbers she had written down before the cruiser pulled up. And he listened with the focused attention of a craftsman hearing specifications. And occasionally he crouched to look at something she described, and ran his hand along the wood, the way you do when you are reading something written in a language you understand better than most. Before he left, Marcus Webb leaned against the post at the top of the porch steps and said something he said with the deliberateness of someone who has chosen to say a thing, rather than let it go unsaid. He said, "I've done work in this neighborhood for going on 15 years. In all that time, nobody has ever called the police on me while I was working a job. But every one of my employees who is black has gotten at least one call, some of them more than one." He paused. "Every single one of them." Diana looked at the street, which was quiet in the late morning way of a street where the people who live on it have gone about their day and left it behind. She said, "That is part of what we are going to change." Diana drove past Gloria Stanton's house that evening on her way to get groceries, not because it was on the most direct route to the store, but because she had decided to drive past it deliberately, with intention, the way she decided things. Gloria was on her front porch when Diana's silver SUV came down Greenwood Lane, and Diana saw her register the car from half a block away, and she watched Gloria straighten slightly, in the way a person straightens when they are deciding whether to perform indifference or acknowledgement. And then Diana drove past slowly enough that the eye contact was unavoidable and complete. And she looked at Gloria with the same neutral, containing expression she used in depositions when she was looking at someone who was going to have to answer for something and did not yet fully understand how much. Gloria looked away first. Gloria Stanton was not operating from pure hatred. She was operating from something that had been sitting inside her for years, something that had never been named or examined or challenged. A set of assumptions about who was out of place in a neighborhood like this one that she had absorbed from somewhere and carried without question and acted on without hesitation. And the reason this mattered was not because it excused anything, but because it was the actual shape of the thing Diana had spent 16 years fighting. Diana pulled into the grocery store parking lot. She wrote a note in her phone: civil tort, false police report, intentional infliction. Consult Leonard Cross. The next morning, the Alexandria Police Department received the preservation order at 9:12, which was 3 hours and 12 minutes after Diana had called her division director at 6 in the morning, before the director's coffee had finished brewing. The order was signed not by Diana, but by the director herself, which removed any argument that this was a personal grievance rather than an institutional matter, and it legally mandated the immediate preservation of every piece of information the Alexandria precinct had generated in connection with Diana's arrest: body cam footage from both officers, dispatch logs, and the audio of Gloria Stanton's original call, all internal communications within the department in the 48 hours following the arrest, and the complete prior complaint record of Officer Ryan Cole, going back to the beginning of his employment. The order arrived on Captain Howell's desk via both email and certified letter simultaneously. Howell read it twice, slowly. He called the city's municipal council at 9:22. The first question municipal council asked was the body cam on? Howell said yes. Municipal council said, both of them. And the pause before Howell's answer, which lasted approximately 4 seconds, communicated the situation more precisely than any sentence would have. Cole was called in at 9:35. He arrived in uniform, still in the posture of a person who believes that the uniform is doing work on their behalf. And he began, before he had fully taken his seat, to explain why the stop had been justified. Howell put the preservation order on the desk in front of him without speaking. Cole picked it up. He read it. He put it back down. Howell said, were both cameras running for the entire encounter? Cole said mine was. Dawson's, I believe so. Howell's face told Cole everything he needed to know about how wrong that answer was. The review of the body cam footage was conducted by an independent digital forensics team from the DOJ, not by the Alexandria Precinct's Internal Affairs Office, and what the footage contained was this: Diana measuring the porch tape measure extended entirely unthreatening, Cole stepping onto her property without requesting permission, Cole's thumb sliding along the badge bottom visible on camera 3 times, Diana citing case law calmly, clearly, Cole's voice in full audio. Lady, I do not know where you got your legal education, but in this neighborhood, when a badge asks you a question, you answer it. People who look like they belong here do not need to argue about it. The cuffs going on at a tension above what was appropriate for a compliant subject. Diana narrating her own compliance out loud for the camera. Cole's voice, again, walking her to the cruiser. People like you make everything harder than it needs to be. The forensics team's note on the footage read, subject was fully compliant throughout. No resistance, no disorderly conduct. Arrest appears to lack probable cause. Language used by arresting officer may constitute evidence of discriminatory intent and warrants referral for criminal civil rights review. Criminal review. Diana set down her coffee cup. She pressed her thumb against the inside of her left wrist and felt the tenderness there, still present, still documenting itself in the living record of her body. Priya Okafor coordinated the federal investigation that opened formally within 72 hours, And what the investigation found was that Cole's 6 prior complaints were not isolated incidents, but a pattern. Every single complainant was Black or Latino. Every single stop had occurred in a residential area with no active crime in progress. Every single charge had been resolved by internal review without finding against the officer, and the average time between filing and closure was 11 days, which was significantly faster than the department's own stated 30-day review timeline, suggesting that the reviews were not particularly thorough. One name in the complaint files appeared with the slightly different disposition language that one of the investigators flagged as anomalous. Hattie Bowman, 71 years old, retired school teacher. Stopped by Cole 18 months earlier while walking her dog near the corner of Greenwood Lane. Detained for 41 minutes. Asked for identification. Produced it. Detained for an additional 22 minutes because Cole had decided he wanted to observe her movements in the area. A disorderly conduct notice filed, later dropped. A complaint filed, marked unsubstantiated in 9 days. Hattie Bowman had then written a letter to Captain Howell asking him to explain what unsubstantiated meant in this context. Howell had not responded. Diana called Leonard Cross. She said there is a woman named Hattie Bowman. She needs to be part of this. She was the first one to try to hold him accountable, and the department buried it. Cross said he would find her. Leonard Cross filed the civil lawsuit on the Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Diana had stood on the precinct steps and made her decision. The complaint named Officer Ryan Cole as the primary defendant, with additional claims against Officer Pete Dawson against Captain Dennis Howell in his official capacity for the pattern of buried complaints under his supervision, and against the City of Alexandria as the employing entity. The causes of action were false arrest, excessive force in the application of restraints producing documentable injury, violation of civil rights under federal statute, and a broader pattern of discriminatory policing practice across 7 years of documented stops. The complaint was a public document from the moment it was filed, and within 48 hours it had been covered by 2 national outlets. Diana did not give interviews. Cross's office released a single statement, 2 sentences. Ms. Caldwell's arrest was unconstitutional. The evidence is comprehensive and unambiguous. Cole was placed on administrative leave with pay. He went home to a house that had been quiet since the night the footage summary appeared on the news. He turned on the television and then turned it off. He sat in his kitchen and thought about the motion his thumb kept starting toward his chest and finding nothing there because the badge was on the kitchen table beside his phone, face up. And he was looking at it from across the room, as not going to it. 3 months after the arrest, a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Washington became the place where Officer Ryan Cole understood in full what he had done. The room smelled of carpet cleaner and cold, recycled air, and the long mahogany table reflected the overhead lights back at the ceiling in a dull, continuous gleam. And the court reporter sat to one side, with her fingers resting lightly on her machine. And the silence before the session began had the particular weight of a room in which things said will become permanent. Cole arrived in a dark suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, the kind of suit a man owns for funerals and formal occasions, and has not had occasion to wear recently enough that he remembered how it fit. And he sat down at the table with the careful stiffness of someone who is performing being at ease, and is not succeeding. And next to him sat the city's defense attorney, Sandra Oaks, who had the practiced composure of someone who had been given an extremely difficult assignment and had decided to be professional about it. Across the long table sat Leonard Cross, and to his right, in the seat she had the right to occupy as the plaintiff, sat Diana Caldwell. She wore a dark blazer. She had a legal pad in front of her. She looked the way she always looked, which was as if she had already thought about this specific situation for considerably longer than anyone else in the room. Cross began with the standard background questions, and Cole moved through them with careful, mechanical accuracy, and he answered each one without embellishment. The performance of a man who has been told by his attorney to say only what is directly asked. Then Cross slid a document across the table. A printed transcript, 5 pages. He pushed it far enough across that Cole could read it without picking it up. Cross read from it aloud, without looking at the document, because he had it memorized. "Lady, I do not know where you got your legal education, but in this neighborhood, when a badge asks you a question, you answer it. People who look like they belong here do not need to argue about it." The court reporter's fingers were still. Cross looked up at Cole. "When you used the phrase, 'people who look like they belong here,' what did you mean?" Cole's answer was the one his attorney had helped him prepare. He had meant people who were obviously residents of the neighborhood, people who could identify themselves and their connection to the property in question. Cross said when Miss Caldwell told you she was the homeowner within 30 seconds of your arrival at the property, did that information factor into your assessment of whether she looked like she belonged there? Cole said he had had no way to verify that claim without seeing identification. Cross picked up a small remote control from the table beside him. He pressed a button. The flat-screen monitor on the far wall activated, and what it showed was Dawson's body cam footage from that October morning, and the audio came through the conference room speakers at a clear, ordinary volume, not loud, just present. And what the room heard was Diana's voice, calm and polite. "Good morning, officer. I am the homeowner. I closed on Thursday." And then Cole's voice, and the specific phrase, "People who look like they belong here do not need to argue about it." The monitor went dark. Sandra Oaks set her pen down on her legal pad. She did not pick it up again. The court reporter lifted her hands from her machine and placed them in her lap. Cole stared at the dark monitor. A vein in his jaw moved once and stopped. The silence lasted 8 seconds. In a deposition room, 8 seconds of silence is an eternity. Cross let it run. Then, quietly, without heat, he said, "Officer Cole, Ms. Caldwell identified herself as the homeowner in her first sentence. She cited the legal standard for the stop accurately within the first 2 minutes of the encounter. She remained physically compliant throughout the arrest. She narrated her compliance out loud for the camera." He paused. "What exactly did she do that morning that made her look like she did not belong there?" Cole opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Diana on her legal pad wrote a single word and underlined it twice. She did not look up. She did not need to. It was already in the record, and the record was exactly what she had been building since the moment the cuffs went on. The civil lawsuit settlement came 6 weeks after the deposition, and the speed of it was, itself, a statement about the strength of the evidence, because municipal settlements do not typically move at 6 weeks. But the civil lawsuit was not all that had been building. The forensics team's note, the one that had used the word criminal, had been taken seriously by people with the authority to act on it. And 4 months after the arrest, in a federal courtroom in Alexandria, Officer Ryan Cole stood at the defendant's table in a charcoal suit that fit worse than the one he had worn to the deposition, and listened to a United States attorney read the charges against him. Deprivation of rights under color of law, which was a federal crime, not a policy violation, not a civil matter, but a crime carrying real consequences in a federal courtroom, with a federal judge who had been on the bench for 19 years and who was known among the attorneys who appeared before her for a quality that had nothing to do with theatrics and everything to do with precision. The trial took 2 days. On the second day, the prosecution played Dawson's body cam footage for the jury, the same footage that had played in the deposition room, and the effect in a courtroom was different from the effect in a conference room. Because a jury of 12 people hearing a man say, "People who look like they belong here," in the context of handcuffing a homeowner on her own driveway, is a different thing than 2 attorneys hearing it across a mahogany table. One juror in the second row pressed her lips together very hard and looked down at her hands. Another in the back row looked at Cole for a long time after the monitor went dark, and then looked away. Cole's attorney made his closing argument. He used the words split-second decision 3 times and context twice, and the jury listened politely and believed none of it. They deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty. The sentencing was 2 weeks later. The Honorable Margaret Osei, who had spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor before taking the bench, and who was therefore not easily surprised by what people were capable of doing with authority, looked down at Ryan Cole from the bench with the expression she reserved for the cases that made her understand most clearly why the work mattered. She said, "Officer Cole, you're given a badge that represented a promise to the people of this city, a promise to see them clearly and treat them fairly, and exercise the power that badge represents with care and accuracy. Instead, you used that badge to punish a black woman who said no to you on her own property. You used it to enforce not the law, but your own opinion about who belongs where. And you did this not once, but across 7 years, leaving a record of harm behind you that this court has now seen in full." She paused. She said, "The law has a name for what you did. It is called deprivation of rights under color of law, and the sentence for it is federal prison." She sentenced him to 38 months in a federal correctional facility, permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification in the state of Virginia, and a fine payable to Hattie Bowman and to a legal defense fund designated by the prosecution. The U.S. Marshals came forward. The handcuffs went on. The sound they made was the same sound they had made on Diana's wrists, which was a gritty, mechanical grinding as the metal ratcheted down. And in the gallery, Diana sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not perform satisfaction. Because this was not a performance. It was a result. And results do not require applause. The civil settlement terms included the following. Captain Dennis Howell accepted early retirement, effective immediately. The Alexandria Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree establishing independent oversight. Mandatory constitutional law training for all officers, and a restructured complaint review process that removed internal review from the equation entirely. And Sandra Oakes, the city's defense attorney, filed the paperwork that completed the civil case on the same afternoon the criminal sentence was handed down. Diana directed the entirety of her personal civil settlement funds to 2 places. Half went to a legal defense fund for low-income residents of Northern Virginia facing unlawful stops. The other half established a scholarship in Marcus's name, not her husband's last name, his first name, Marcus, for first-generation law students from Baltimore, where she had grown up, and where he had grown up, and where she had first understood that the law was something you could use to change things that needed changing. Leonard Cross called her with the final numbers. Diana was sitting on her porch when the call came in, because the porch was finished by then, Marcus Webb having completed the new railings 3 weeks earlier, and the railing was solid under her hand when she reached out to hold it while she listened. Cross went through the terms one by one, and she confirmed each one, and at the end he said, "Diana, this is a complete result." She said, "It is a beginning." She said thank you to Cross, who had earned it. She hung up. She held the railing. Leonard Cross filed the civil tort against Gloria Stanton on the same day the settlement was finalized. And what the legal process required of Gloria was something she had never been required to do in 67 years of living her life according to her assumptions. Answer under oath a series of questions about how she had made her decisions. Questions like, of all the calls she had made in 3 years as neighborhood watch captain about individuals she did not recognize, how many of those individuals were white, and how many were not? Her attorney advised her to settle. The settlement required a financial payment to the same legal defense fund Diana's personal settlement had established, and it required a written public apology in the Claremont Hills HOA newsletter, 2 paragraphs in Gloria's own words saying what it needed to say, which was that she had called the police on a black woman who was standing on her own property, and that she had done so because she had made an assumption without examining it about who belonged in this neighborhood and who did not, and that the assumption was wrong and had caused serious harm, and that she was sorry. The apology ran in the December newsletter. The letters section in January contained responses from 9 neighbors, most of whom said some version of, "Thank you for saying this out loud." Gloria moved out of Claremont Hills the following spring. The neighborhood watch fleece unzipped hung on the hook by her front door on moving day. She looked at it once before she went out to the truck. She did not go back for it. Hattie Bowman received a check and a letter from Cross's office in November. The The letter explained that her complaint had been formally reopened under the federal investigation, reviewed by an independent examiner and substantiated. At the bottom was a handwritten note, 3 lines in Diana's handwriting. It said your complaint was the first one. You were right. I am sorry it took this long. Hattie read the note at her kitchen table. Her dog, the same dog she was walking when Cole stopped her, was asleep at her feet. She folded the note carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept the things that matter. Ryan Cole was processed into a federal correctional facility in Northern Virginia on a Tuesday in February. And the facility was not what he had seen in movies, not the white-collar minimum security camp he had perhaps imagined in the weeks between sentencing and reporting, but a medium-security federal institution with a general population that had its own economy, and its own social structure, and its own awareness of who was arriving and why. Because news moves through institutions faster than paperwork does. The intake officer who processed him was a broad-shouldered man who had been doing this job for 14 years and who had no particular feeling about Cole one way or the other, because he processed 11 new inmates a week, and none of them were remarkable to him, which was, in its own way, the harshest thing about it. He was assigned a number. He was assigned a uniform. He was shown to a bunk in a cell block that smelled of industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that was older and harder to name. And the first night he lay on the bunk and stared at the ceiling, which was concrete, and he thought about the badge that was not on his chest. And he thought about the kitchen table in the house he no longer lived in, because Kendra had asked him to leave 4 months earlier. And he thought about the morning on Greenwood Lane and the tape measure on the porch railing, and the look Diana Caldwell had given him in the booking room after the cuffs came off, which was not anger and not triumph, and was something more difficult than either of those things, which was the calm, comprehensive look of someone who had seen him clearly and found him exactly as small as she had expected. He put his arm over his eyes. The light in the cell block never fully went dark. Someone 2 tiers down was laughing about something. The building settled around him with the specific sounds of a building that has held a great many people against their will for a great many years. He was going to be here for 38 months. He was going to be ordinary here. The Alexandria Police Department's new mandatory training program launched in January under the terms of the consent decree, and the core module, the one that every recruit watched on their first day of the academy, before they watched anything else, was built around Dawson's body cam footage from that October morning on Greenwood Lane. The module was called, "Who Has the Right to Be Here?" And it did not editorialize. It simply showed the footage, Diana measuring the porch, Cole arriving, the badge thumb gesture in close-up, the verbal exchange, the arrest, the booking room. And then, after the footage, it showed the complaint record and the sentencing, and Hattie Bowman, who had agreed to record a 90-second statement for the module in which she described in her own plain language what it was like to be detained for 41 minutes while walking her dog near her own home, and then to file a complaint and receive a letter 11 days later telling her the complaint was unsubstantiated, and to write a follow-up letter to the captain and receive no reply. Every recruit watched Hattie Bowman's 90 seconds in silence. The training coordinator noted in her quarterly report that Hattie Bowman's statement was the moment in the curriculum that produced the most durable change in subsequent officer behavior during field evaluations. The module was adopted by 4 other departments in the region within the first year. On a Sunday morning in March, 5 months after the sentencing, Diana Caldwell stood on her finished wraparound porch with a mug of black coffee in both hands and watched Greenwood Lane wake up, which it did, slowly and in stages on Sunday mornings. The new railings were solid under her hand when she reached out to test them, the way she sometimes did not because she doubted Marcus Webb's work, but because the solidity of it pleased her, the way a well-made thing always pleased her. The fact of something being exactly as sound as it appeared to be. A police cruiser turned onto Greenwood Lane from the far end and moved down the street at the measured pace of a routine Sunday patrol. The officer inside was young, and he had gone through the new training program and had watched the body cam footage and had watched Hattie Bowman's 90 seconds and had spent considerable time thinking about the question the module asked, which did not have a tidy answer, and was the kind of question that was useful precisely because of that. He rolled his window down and lifted one hand in greeting. Diana lifted her mug. The cruiser moved on, and the sound of it faded down the lane beneath the oaks, and the lane was quiet again. She pressed her right thumb gently against the inside of her left wrist. The habit, the ritual, the thing she had always done when her mind was working on something and needed an anchor. And she felt the skin there smooth and healed the marks of that October morning, entirely gone from the surface of things, though they were everywhere in the record, in the federal database, in the consent decree, in the training module, in Hattie Bowman's drawer, in the scholarship fund carrying Marcus's name, in the changed procedures of a department that was slowly, imperfectly, actually trying to become what it had always said it was. She took a sip of her coffee. She went back inside. The tape measure was on the kitchen table where she had left it. She picked it up. She had more to do. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something about the power of staying calm when everything inside you wants to fight back, about the courage it takes to let the truth build itself into something that cannot be ignored, then please take 1 second right now and hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps our channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you're not yet subscribed to our channel, please do it now. We put out new stories every week, stories about justice, about ordinary people who refused to be diminished, about the moment when power finally meets accountability. And we would love for you to be here for every one of them. Hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. If you know someone who is going through something difficult right now, someone who needs to be reminded that staying composed and knowing your worth is not weakness, but the most powerful thing in the world, share this video with them today. We will see you in the next story. And remember, the record always matters. Write down the name.